This video lecture is going to be about climate change in municipalities. There will be an introduction to the entire topic, but there will be some focus on what is called mitigation in this presentation. Then there is a second climate change in municipalities presentation, recorded presentation, that has focused more on adaptation. Mitigation and adaptation go into each other sometimes, as we will see in this recording. If you don't like the word municipalities there, you can replace this word with cities and local government if you'd like. I'm using the English translation of what is called in Swedish kommun, municipalities, as a sort of a catch-all word. I'm generally talking about mid-sized to larger cities, but sometimes cities include some of the surrounding area, not just the built-up urban area. It depends upon where you are in the world and what definitions, practical and legal and governmental definitions we have of a city and a municipality. So, for some people, there were a number of environmental problems in the past, and out of this arises climate change as the main environmental problem of this century. For other people, all other kinds of environmental problems have been replaced by climate problems. All other kinds of environmental problems are evaluated based on climate change. There are people that do that. Of course, there are climate change deniers still, but there are fewer and fewer of them. There are more climate change action delayers. These points here about how climate change as a problem takes over many things, these were put into a diagram by Jan Konietzko. He called this carbon tunnel vision. We can see where the picture of him and where the picture comes from. That there are a number of different kinds of problems, but people just have this tunnel vision to just look at carbon emissions and that particular part of global heating. And that's a problem. So we have a centrality of global heating in much of the environmental discourse and policy making. And this arises for a variety of reasons. Perhaps that climate scientists and governments that have championed global heating and that we need to combat have been successful. But I think it's because there are mistaken positions and understanding among the public, perhaps driven in some cases by a bubble in social media. I'm not saying that human-induced global heating is a problem. It is a serious problem. But rather, we, and you who are watching this, you create problems if you reduce all environmental problems down to just climate. What about biodiversity? There are all kinds of other problems. Instead, I think we should much rather have a planetary boundaries paradigm where global heating is one of several environmental problems. Perhaps more importantly, we should think more in terms of Earth system boundaries where justice and fairness in society are also included. But that will be one or other lectures or other video essays to watch and to make. Also, by having everything sort of being reduced down to climate change, where is the room for sustainability in discourse? The IPCC warns itself and warns us that too much of a focus on climate could blind us to achieving sustainability and blind us to just the problems that there are for achieving sustainability. We have to make sure that there are twin goals. We want to have less climate impact by human society, and we want to have a sustainable future. In practice, we want to make sure that these goals don't come into conflict with each other. And in this document here, the IPCC asked itself, how can we work in ways so that our scenario building and our mitigation work will not lose sight of the development needs in sustainability? So part of the report is reminding the IPCC, people involved in that themselves, to not forget about sustainability, but part also to make sure that everyone else thinks about this. But of course, this isn't one of these famous IPCC reports, the ones the media reports on. The media has a tendency to report on, if at all, the COP meetings, the climate COP meetings, and then the release of the main IPCC reports. These other reports, in the meantime, you don't hear about it. And you don't hear about it on social media, and you don't hear about it in traditional media, unless, of course, you're watching some university lecturer who's talking about these kinds of things, but most of us aren't doing that, of course. When it comes to climate change or global heating and local government or cities and municipalities, generally everything is, all matters having to do with climate change are divided into two categories. We have on the one hand mitigation and on the other hand adaptation. And this division into mitigation and adaptation is mirrored in various IPCC documents. And that's something which is important for you to understand, the differences between those two. Obviously there's a continuity error. I realized as I was editing this that I did not provide a good definition of mitigation at this point in time, so I need to reshoot and edit this in. And so I'm paraphrasing some of the definitions and understanding of the IPCC in one of its reports, which I will include here, a reference to it, what they talk about mitigation and what they mean by that. They are actions or activities with the intention of limiting emissions of so-called greenhouse gases or GHG, so that the amount of greenhouse gases entering the atmosphere is reduced or limited, or otherwise that such gases are removed from the atmosphere so that the total level of such gases in the atmosphere is lower. They specifically mention, at least in the source that I'm using to create this definition, energy sector, where energy production and energy use, land use, for example, agriculture, but even other areas for that, and they talk about areas that are carbon sinks, where it's important that that the natural removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere can continue with so-called carbon sinks. We want to have the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere below thresholds. And the reason we want to do this is to make sure that human civilization as we understand it today can continue, and ecological processes necessary for ecosystem services that support humanization are kept and maintained. And the reason we want to do this is we want to try to achieve the goals that have been set out in various international agreements, most recently the so-called Paris Agreement. So our strategies and policies and plans will require an understanding of what lies behind the emissions of greenhouse gases and the effects of too high levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But also, we have to understand and realize what technical policy and social influence factors, what technical policy, social and economic factors influence our emissions, to make sure that we can, by understanding the emissions themselves and their effects, but also why the emissions occur, that needs to inform our various strategies, policies, and plans. Municipalities are important because increasingly that's where going to be the majority of people in the world are living. And where the majority of people living will mean that there will be a concentration of agricultural products, there will be a concentration of energy use. I mean, some heavy industry is not located in the city, but municipalities or cities are important. And if we look at the local level, say if we look at a mid-sized or large city, and this is a problem because what is meant by a mid-sized or larger city? I mean, there are cities that are considered mid-sized in China, which are perhaps considered large cities in a country like the United States. But in municipalities, a mid-sized city or a large city, besides that, as I mentioned before, that this is an area where there are a lot of resources that are concentrated and a lot of people that are living, and inhabitants in cities have a tendency to drive consumer demands. But cities provide a focused level for action. This is a geographically delimited area. Cities end up being very concrete as opposed to a large country, the United States or the People's Republic of China, or even a large country like France or Germany. A city becomes an area which is much more concreted. It's possible to concentrate resources to work in particular areas. It's also possible to get an overview as opposed to a country, a medium-sized country, even like Sweden or Denmark or New Zealand or something like that. So at least it might be possible to get an overview about what's happening and to have a big picture and look at climate change and other of the planetary boundaries, but also relate that to sustainability in a concrete level, which is delimited, and there is some political power and some kind of autonomy in that area. Also, at a local level, it's possible to work with both mitigation and adaptation at the same time. There are a number of countries that say something to the effect, national governments that say that mitigation is something that we do at the national level, adaptation is something that you do at the local level. And the reason for that is that in a large enough country, there are great differences. Adaptation is difficult in a large country. There are many different local climates and ecosystems, the physical location of city, and there are various challenges. There's no one size that fits all, so to speak. A mid-sized city might be one that starts at about 500,000 people and higher. A large city might be several million or more. Also, we could have a place where there are several mid-sized cities and maybe one large city, and that's a metropolitan area. In some cases, the large city has expanded out and absorbed some of the mid-sized cities nearby. In some cases, the cities together are one functional unit, but they're not politically integrated. Municipalities can be an area where we have a focused level for our actions. Things get very concrete. It's possible we can decide over things and allocate resources for change relatively easily. And it's perhaps also possible for decision makers in a city to get an overview in a way that would be much more difficult, say, in a large country like Germany or Spain. Another potential advantage is that at the local level, politicians and others can work with both mitigation and adaptation at the same time instead of separating out mitigation and adaptation, and that might be advantageous. At a regional or national level, direct mitigation is in part possible. We have national taxes and we have regulations, but indirect mitigation might be more difficult. Local decisions that impact on emissions, that might be difficult to do at a regional level, national level. What can a municipality or city do when it comes to mitigation? I have made an overview table. Now, of course, this can depend from country to country what powers a city has in relation to the national or regional level. If we look at the table, we'll look to the left. A municipality is looking at its own operations, its own fleet of vehicles, its own buildings, how the buildings are heated and cooled, how the buildings are designed and built, how they are maintained, the choice of vehicle type and how they're used. This is something that the city can control directly, unless, of course, it's sold all its buildings to the private real estate market and is renting back its own buildings. In that case, the city has limited power in the short term. Moving one column over, we come to purchasing or procurement. The city can attempt to orient its purchasing of items used to provide service in the city, schools and food, for example, to reduce climate impacts. One more column over, other services that the city provides, public transport, say bus services, and energy utilities. During the last decade of the 1900s, a number of cities in Germany sold their citywide energy companies to private energy companies. This gave them fast cash to deal with some other issues or lower taxes. But in the long term, from the perspective of sustainability and climate change, such cities have come to regret this decision. They cannot have much of an energy policy. In the past, they could make some decisions directly. Now they're stuck trying to convince large multinational energy companies to do what the city wants. To be sure, such large multinational energy companies might have common climate goals, but what the city wants to achieve might not score high on the company goals and strategies. It was not just German cities that did this sellout. In the past, the city of Malmö in Sweden did the same. I think there are a number of cities around the world who have come to regret selling off such a valuable asset so that they no longer can have a locally based autonomous energy policy to help reduce carbon emissions. Or at least they did not sell off their parking spaces like the city of Chicago did, with really, really awful results. But the mayor at the time could bounce the books and kick the can down the road to a new generation of politicians and city residents. That was a really smart move. Next column over is governance, to attempt to transform and encourage residents' lifestyles and consumption patterns towards low-carbon paths. The same can be said with various organizations in and around the city. The column on the far right involves collaboration with other levels of government and other cities and municipalities located in geographic proximity. It's January 2025, and I've got to get this recording done before the end of the month, and the weather is not very cooperative for me, or indeed for us. This is the weather in January in southern Sweden, fog and haze, and it started raining. I'm introducing the topic of land use planning and local government and mitigation of climate change. You can think about this in relationship to the overview table about mitigation you saw before. We can promote public transit and bike lanes all we want and electrify vehicles, but if the distance traveled remain high, as long as cities continue to plan and have zoning based around car travel and low-density land use. What we can see here is the western edge of the city of Lund, where some 20 years ago, this outskirts of the city was so-called developed on high-quality farmland. Some of the best farmland in all of Sweden. So-called developing such high-quality farmland, a limited resource, should be considered a criminal act. You might not agree with me with that, but perhaps I feel like I have to exaggerate to make a point. Particularly when we consider a changing climate in the future, more pressure will be brought to bear on existing agricultural land the world over. We will need to grow more food for more people, and there may be crop losses because of weather events caused by global heating in various locations. And yet this shopping center and parking has ruined prime agricultural land in southern Sweden. Sweden, a country supposedly environmentally progressive. Everywhere in the world, cities are taking over agricultural land, building on and paving over agricultural land. In some places like the United States, with a legacy of suburban sprawl, agricultural land has been lost to suburbia, clearly a problem. But this is not unique to the United States. The People's Republic of China, despite high-density housing in urban areas, China has lost huge amounts of agricultural land in the name of industry, and the People's Republic of China has made itself vulnerable to relying more and more on agricultural imports. Where's the long-term thinking in all of this? Where can we find climate change here? I mean, it was rather clear, if we're looking at Lund 20 years ago, the likelihood of climate change was really high, and yet the politicians continued behaving as if land use policies and transport policies had nothing to do with climate change. The politicians in the city might say something like this: well, look, Joe, this is a popular city. The university attracts students. Students who attend the universities create and get employed by high-tech companies. We have the hospital, which needs to have more buildings for specialty care. What were we supposed to do? Okay. We can argue this back and forth, and recently it seems like the city of Lund has been much more restrictive when it comes to building on prime agricultural land. Maybe they got the message. we can talk about climate plans in cities, and some describe these as climate action plans in cities. And one of the reasons for this is that you could have national level decisions that require cities to have climate plans, not just a document with beautiful ideas and describing the problems, but that some kind of action is going to take place. And in some cases, you could have an overarching climate plan that takes a specific climate plan that looks at the entire city. In other cases, you could have sections of the economy or sectors of what the city is doing. And there could be various plans and policy documents that don't have climate as the central focus, but have to do with policy areas in the city. And that you look at each of those policy areas from the perspective of the climate, and that influences how you write your plans and policy documents. Or existing documents might be rewritten from the perspective of global heating. So all cities we can consider to be more or less unique. Each plan is written based on a certain context, and there could be national level decisions that force cities to do certain things, or force cities not to do certain things. So we could imagine that a city in country A that is a very similar kind of climate and hydrology as opposed to a city B in another country, the plans might look quite different because of the different national contexts. Or you could have two cities, we'll say C and D in this case, in the same large country. So that might make the plans somewhat similar, but because of the different meteorology and the different hydrology, and whether you're located on the coast, for example, or not, and the topography in the area, then the actual context will be quite different. So the plans might look quite different. Plans being written at different times, certain words like resilience might be in vogue and used a lot, whereas other times maybe the word will fall out of usage and you won't find that in a plan as often. Or there could be certain events that have taken place, and that international events, and that is reflected in the choice of words and the importance that are put on different parts in the climate action plan. So everything is based in a spatial and a political context, but also a temporal context, what we see. We could imagine a city which has an overarching climate plan, and in the various parts of the plan, there are references made to other documents that have been rewritten from the perspective of global heating, or not. We could also see a city perhaps where there's something which sounds like a fantastic overarching climate plan, and then we notice the other kinds of documents in the city are not affected at all. That sounds like, in that case, maybe the climate plan is just something PR, relationships to sort of show we have the plan, but we're actually not going to do anything. Next up, I'd like to provide some of the findings. All right. Next up, I'd like to provide some of the findings from two articles. These articles, Rekien from 2018 and Grafakos from 2020. Or Rekien et al. And Grafikos et al. If you look very closely at all the authors there, you can see that there's a striking similarity between all the authors, but in a different order. And what they've done, they've reported on in one article, and then they've worked more on it, and they've reported on another. They have gathered more than 800 documents from various cities in the EU, and this is from a time when the United Kingdom was a member state in the EU. So it's EU 28 members in the EU. And they have, in some cases, not just gathered the documents, they've interviewed people that worked in that particular city where the document came from, if there was something that they weren't quite clear about. And they made sure that there was somebody in their research group who knew the language that the document was written in. So they've covered all these different kinds of languages in it. And they developed a common kind of methodology or framework to work with these documents. I'll provide in the video description a reference to the articles, so you can look at them yourself. So, some findings that these researchers have from looking at these over 800 documents from as many cities in the EU 28 around the time 2018, around the time 2020, in other words, just before the pandemic. They find that the overwhelming majority of the city plans, we'll call them climate action plans, are only about mitigation. However, 26% are only about adaptation, and 17% include both mitigation and adaptation. They also find this. They divide all the documents they have into 3 types. They call them the A for autonomous. A1 is autonomously produced. In other words, the city, perhaps for internal reasons, decides to make their document or their climate action plan. A2 cities are ones where they have plans that they have to make the plan because at the national level there is some sort of regulation that requires cities to make climate action plans. In some cases, in some countries, it's not just that the plans are required, it actually stipulates what should be in the plan in terms of the structure and the scope and level of detail. A3, the plans were made because the particular city was a member in a network of cities, and the membership in the network meant that the cities felt compelled to work with climate change. Continuing on with being why cities do this, was it just an autonomous decision, or were they forced to because of national level regulations, or were they felt themselves forced to because they were members in some sort of a network of cities? What other kinds of factors contribute? What other are, shall we call them, drivers over and above what was mentioned in the previous slide there? The size of the city, all other things being equal, larger cities have a tendency to make plans and maybe more extensive climate action plans. We have the national level regulations that compel cities, and being a member in the network of the cities like I mentioned before, and the 2 articles mentioned as example of networks, the EU Covenant of Mayors and the UN Compact of Mayors. However, the articles completely missed the C40 network. And the C40 network originally consisted of 40 cities around the world which had climate change goals, carbon reduction primarily. And the headquarters of this organization sort of flips between some of the larger cities that are members in this. And there are more than 40 cities now, but they retain the name of C40. And you sort of feel compelled to have some sort of action. Otherwise, it looks embarrassing if you're not a member, you're not doing something, and you're a member of the C40 network. But the authors of these 2 articles, by mistake or whatever reason, missed that particular network. That would be, an important network to include. That national regulations lead to action. They looked at this more closely. They looked at cities in countries where there was a national regulation that cities have to have climate action plans, and then they looked at cities in countries where there is no such obligation. And they've tried to make a comparison there. And their findings are that cities are 2 times more likely to have a climate action plan, including mitigation, if there are national regulations, and cities are 5 times more likely to have a climate action plan, including adaptation, if there are national regulations. The authors of the studies looked more closely at the effect of national regulations, that there are decisions at the national level which compel cities to make climate action plans. What happens? And can we make a comparison? What is the effect of that? They looked at the countries in the EU at the time, not very many, that had regulations at the national level that compelled cities to make climate action plans. And they compare that to all the other ones. The majority of country EU member states didn't require that at the time. And they found, all other things being equal, that cities that were in countries with natural regulations, they were 2 times more likely to have a climate action plan that included mitigation. They were 5 times more likely to have a climate action plan that included adaptation. Next up, I'd like to provide some of the findings from 2 articles. These articles, Rekian from 2018 and Grafakos from 2020, or Rekian et al. And Grafakos et al. If you look very closely at all the authors there, you can see that there's a striking similarity between all the authors, but in a different order. And what they've done, they've reported on in one article, and then they've worked more on it, and they've reported on another. They have gathered more than 800 documents from various cities in the EU, and this is from a time when the United Kingdom was a member state in the EU. So it's EU 28 members in the EU. And they have, in some cases, not just gathered the documents, they've interviewed people that worked in that particular city where the document came from, if there was something that they weren't quite clear about. And they made sure that there was somebody in their research group who knew the language that the document was written in. So they've covered all these different kinds of languages in it. And they developed a common kind of methodology or framework to work with these documents. I'll provide in the video description a reference to the articles, so you can look at them yourself. So, some findings that these researchers have from looking at these over 800 documents from as many cities in the EU 28, around the time 2018, around the time 2020, in other words, just before the pandemic. They find that the overwhelming majority of the city plans, we'll call them climate action plans, are only about mitigation. However, 26% are only about adaptation, and 17% include both mitigation and adaptation. They also find this. They divide all the documents they have into 3 types. They call them the A for autonomous. A1 is autonomously produced. In other words, the city, perhaps for internal reasons, decides to make their document or their climate action plan. A2 cities are ones where they have plans that they have to make the plan because at the national level there is some sort of regulation that requires cities to make climate action plans. In some cases, in some countries, it's not just that the plans are required, it actually stipulates what should be in the plan in terms of the structure and the scope and level of detail. A3, the plans were made because the particular city was a member in a network of cities, and the membership of the network meant that the cities felt compelled to work with climate change. Continuing on with being why cities do this, was it just an autonomous decision, or were they forced to because of national level regulations, or were they felt themselves forced to because they were members in some sort of a network of cities? What other kinds of factors contribute? What other are, shall we call them, drivers over and above what was mentioned in the previous slide there? The size of the city, all other things being equal, larger cities have a tendency to make plans and maybe more extensive climate action plans. We have the national level regulations that compel cities, and being a member in the network of the cities like I mentioned before, and the 2 articles mentioned as example of networks, the EU Covenant of Mayors and the UN Compact of Mayors. However, the articles completely miss the C40 network, and the C40 network originally consisted of 40 cities around the world which had climate change goals, carbon reduction primarily. The headquarters of this organization sort of flips between some of the larger cities that are members in this. And there are more than 40 cities now, but they retain the name of C40. And you sort of feel compelled to have some sort of action. Otherwise, it looks embarrassing if you're not a member, you're not doing something, and you're a member of the C40 network. But the authors of these 2 articles, by mistake or whatever reason, missed that particular network. That would be, an important network to include. That national regulations lead to action. They looked at this more closely. They looked at cities in countries where there was a national regulation that cities have to have climate action plans, and then they looked at cities and countries where there is no such obligation, and they've tried to make a comparison there. And their findings are that cities are 2 times more likely to have a climate action plan, including mitigation, if there are national regulations, and cities are 5 times more likely to have a climate action plan, including adaptation, if there are national regulations. The authors of the studies looked more closely at the effect of national regulations, that there are decisions at the national level which compel cities to make climate action plans. What happens? And can we make a comparison? What is the effect of that? They looked at the countries in the EU at the time, not very many, that had regulations at the national level that compelled cities to make climate action plans. And they compare that to all the other ones. The majority of EU member states didn't require that at the time. And they found, all other things being equal, that cities that were in countries with natural regulations, they were 2 times more likely to have a climate action plan that included mitigation. They were 5 times more likely to have a climate action plan that included adaptation. They then went on to speculate in some cases, but also based on the analysis of the documents they had and documents that they didn't have from some cities. Why do some cities not have climate action plans? And they posit that these are the reasons, that the cities have some sort of lack of general capacity, that the cities have low levels of competence in city administration, or that they're missing something, that the local political interest in the given city, human-induced global heating, is just not a topic for whatever reasons. The local politicians, the local political parties, the sort of political culture there. Human-induced global heating is not part of this. They also mentioned, but this was only applicable for some countries with some cities, that in some countries, national regulations say that some climate planning is not the responsibility of the city, that it could be the responsibility of a region that the city is in, and therefore the city doesn't have anything. They also point out that in the EU countries where income levels are lower compared to the EU average, cities are less likely to have climate action plans. Some other findings that these articles came up with. Again, I'm not specifying exactly which one of the 2 articles have those findings, because I consider these to be sort of like a part 1 and part 2 article. The same data set, the same fundamental methodology, essentially the same authors, asking slightly different questions, carrying out with different kind of analytical methods to find out some of the answers to the questions they have. They find that in the case if you have a city that has a climate action plan that combines mitigation and adaptation into one plan, they find that there's a greater likelihood that their plan will then have connections to other plans in the city that already exist, and there'll be a greater likelihood of alignment between the climate action plan and the other kinds of plans or planning documents in the city. And then which kinds of plans or planning documents are most likely to have alignment? That the climate plan and the other plan are likely to have links, or they write things in such a way that there's an alignment. So we see that the authors of the study didn't just look at 885 documents from these cities. They, in some cases, looked at a lot more documents in related areas. They found that sustainability, whatever that is, that there was a strong likelihood, if there was a combined mitigation and adaptation climate plan, that there was a higher likelihood of there being alignment between what was written in the sustainability report and what was written in the climate action plan. They found, but not as common, that in some cities there was a linkage between the spatial planning development document, land use planning, and the climate action plan. And they also found that emergency response documents or emergency response planning or disaster management or something similar could have linkages. Things that they found seldom sort of connections apparently would be, shall we say, more social kind of plans. Although they did find in some cases that in some cities that there was a connection between health. On the other hand, as they point out, in some cases, public health may not be the responsibility of the city in question. It could be a regional question, and therefore the city might not be writing about it because it's not part of the city's normal kind of responsibility. Which just goes to show that sometimes it's difficult to compare the plans without understanding the context behind it, depending upon responsibilities divided up horizontally from the national level down to the local level, and how you could have in parallel a regional governmental authority that has responsibility for some things, which in another country is the responsibility of the individual city. In one of the articles there is a table which has a similarity to my mitigation table, but this table that you see here is my own work, not based on the two articles that I've just talked about. Take my table from one of those articles. I made this up on my own work based on my reading of other articles and other chapters in books and in looking at city climate adaptation plans previously, before those articles came out. And so I thought I would say something about this. In the mid-2010s, I made a small review. I chose a number of cities at a global level and looked at some of their plans and tried to make a comparison among them and tried to find findings. I thought that I'd share with you some of the findings and observations I had. We'll begin with New York City. This was a document that New York City issued after being hit by Hurricane Sandy, which caused tremendous flooding in certain parts of New York City. And by New York City, I don't just mean, and they also didn't mean that, just Manhattan, because New York City consists of Manhattan and 4 other locations. And one of the important points in the beginning of the document was that New Yorkers are tough, so we will be up to this situation. And when things get tough, the tough get going, that kind of thing. And we will never, ever give up the waterfront around Manhattan. But at the same time, you could hear interviews of climate scientists and other natural scientists who were involved as, shall we say, consultants or experts for the New York plan. And the then mayor of New York City thought it was important to say that New Yorkers are tough. But he also thought, to create legitimacy, just like we have an IPCC, there should be some sort of a New York City version of that, where they took people from universities in New York City and nearby and asked them to provide their scientific expertise and to be part of the planning document process. And some of these people said, when it was, we'll never give up the waterfront, there's no way we will be able to defend the waterfront all around all of Manhattan, let alone other areas. In this planning document, there even was an idea where you see the bay south of New York City. We have Long Island on one side and Staten Island on the other. There was even written up what would be technically feasible to put a huge barrier between the Atlantic Ocean and those bays in the area of New York City, where the bays function as sort of like an arm of the Atlantic Ocean coming in. They didn't talk about how much it would cost, but they had that sort of wild idea to do that. Yeah. There are other kinds of cities at this time that had various kinds of plans. In Rotterdam, you could read at the time, sometimes some of these plans were not readily available in some of these cities on their websites. You really had to do a lot of detective work to find them. Anyway, one of the things that one of the plans around this time Rotterdam said, they talked about how they would need to make changes in the city with planning, but also with infrastructure, water infrastructure. And they concluded at one point, there are business opportunities that present themselves with climate change adaptation. In other words, we Dutch, we in Rotterdam in particular, are really good about building below sea level. And we're really good with building dikes and pumps and water hydrology management and engineering. So when we perfect this for our own city, we can sell this to other cities around the world. For some of you, you might find this to be sort of almost poor taste, considering that they're thinking about, there are a lot of people around the world that be suffering, but we can earn money off of this terrible thing that's happening. Looking at Singapore at the more or less the same time, a difference, of course, between Singapore and Rotterdam and New York. Okay, it's a port city and a world-class city, so to speak, but it's also city-state. The city and the country, the nation, are the same. And they approached the whole problem almost from an ISO 14001 environmental management system-like perspective, given some of the diagrams and flowcharts they made. It was quite striking. And if we have enough time and enough warning, we should be able to protect vital infrastructure. That shouldn't be a problem. And they pointed out to examples how they had already built like entrances to subway stations that you had to go above the street level so there wouldn't be any water flooding into the subway system. And they concluded that their actual biggest problem will be supplies and logistics, because this is a city which is extremely dependent on trade. They can't grow enough food to feed everyone in the city themselves. And climate change, they could foresee, would disrupt trade. They could also see that climate disasters elsewhere, not taking place in Singapore itself, could mean that the source of imports of, say, food could become a serious problem for them. But also, they don't have any place to put waste. I mean, to be able to recycle and so forth. There's really no room. They want to, so to speak, outsource all the waste management to some other place outside of the city. And even if we don't think about recycling, how about things that can't be recycled? There's no place in Singapore to have a landfill. So where are we going to put all our waste? That was one of the things that was one of the sort of serious problems that the city saw. If we look at Durban, South Africa, a city in a more poor to middle income country, and Durban, South Africa is an important port for South Africa, meaning that it's very similar to the other cities in that sense on the coast and a port city. Durban functions as the port for Johannesburg, so to speak. And as opposed to the other cities, you could tell that Durban, South Africa put people and the people's well-being much closer to the center of a lot of their planning. And as opposed to New York City, they also said there might be places along the coast we'll just have to give up. We won't be able to defend it. One, we don't have enough money to defend it, and two, even if we had enough money, it's a lost cause. If we defend parts of the coast for 50 years after that, we'll have to spend more money to defend our defenses that are defending the coast, and so forth. So in some ways, a much more realistic kind of situation. On the other hand, maybe this reflects the fact that the city doesn't have as much money as some of the other cities have, and so they have to put more emphasis on people, and the people's robustness and resilience, and the people's agility. And they were looking a lot more at health compared to some of the other cities. So again, we see that depending upon where in the world, the economic situation, but also the narrative of the city itself. This is a city built on the idea of business, so we're going to find business opportunities in the face of adversity. New Yorkers are tough, and so forth. A very managerial kind of perspective, like running the city as if it was a company. So, time for us to go on to the next